Hello, friends, and welcome back to Unsolved Ramblings with me, your host, Danielle. I am making some changes going in a few directions with the podcast. I will be featuring unsolved missing persons cases, but I will also be rambling about unsolved homicides and mysterious murders. The authorities are desperate for our help in solving these cases. Before we dive right into today's episode, I'd like to state that I am not an expert and that this is for entertainment purposes. All information comes from sources published online. All sources are linked in the description of this video. We have all heard of the Bermuda Triangle, right? Well, did you know that there are several triangles of land where many people have gone missing, and authorities are baffled as to why these particular places are a breeding ground for crime? In this episode, we will ramble about a stretch of land located in the corner of Washington and on the Idaho border, where a serial killer brutalized a community. It is known as the Lewis-Clark Valley, comprised of three cities, Lewiston, Clarkston, and Asotin, forming the shape of a triangle. It is named after the famous expedition of Lewis and Clark, who camped at the confluence of the Clearwater and Snake Rivers during their journey westward across America. 6 miles down the river is Asotin, Washington. This area is known to be a beautiful oasis of forests, flatlands, and rivers. The majority of the area is isolated, and that is one of the many things that the residents say is the allure. Despite being isolated from the many evils of the big cities, between the years of 1979 to 1982, there was a serial killer walking among the members of the community. Many people feel one man is responsible for 3 murders and 2 disappearances. Unfortunately for the residents of the communities he haunts, he remains free to live his life. The tale of these twisted tragedies begins on April 28, 1979, when Christina White vanished. Christina was described as a hyperactive 12-year-old girl growing up in Asotin, Washington. Christina was your normal run-of-the-mill, fun-loving, adventurous, full of wonder, and a life of promise ahead of her. On the morning of April 28th, Christina joined her mother and younger sister for a morning of enjoyment at the county fair. They ate lunch together before they parted ways. Christina rode her bicycle over to her friend Rose's house to help Rose with her horse. In those days, children had a lot more freedom to roam from place to place on their own. And Christina loved to help Rose with her horse, even dreamed of owning one herself someday. As Christina's mother got a ride home, they drove past Rose's house, and the last time Christina's mother saw her was on the porch of Rose's home, waving to her. A couple hours later, around 2 p.m., Christina called her mother to say that she didn't feel well. Having a history of getting overheated, Christina's mother tells her to get a cold cloth and put it on her neck and to rest until she feels better. When she did not hear from her or see her come home, her mother thought she went on to help Rose with her horse. As 7 p.m. rolls around, Christina is nowhere to be found. Christina's parents begin searching all around for her. At Rose's house, along the route between Rose's and their home, nothing. Christina's father even went down to the carnival to see if Christina had still been there or if anything was out of the ordinary. Authorities did consider the people who worked for the carnival as they lead a sort of transient lifestyle and were in town on the day she went missing. Christina's father even followed the carnival out of town to the next town and the next for quite a while before giving up and returning home. Authorities were baffled. Christina's parents were asked to take a polygraph test, which they both passed and were ruled out as suspects. There were no witnesses, no clues, no evidence to assist authorities in finding her. The last person known to have seen Christina was her friend Rose, who left Christina at her house to go tend to her horse. It is believed that Rose's mother's boyfriend was also in the home when Rose left. Christina and her bicycle were never located, and with no suspects and no leads, the case quickly goes cold. In June of 1981, another young girl goes missing. Kristen David, a promising college student studying to be a journalist at the University of Idaho, located in Moscow, about a 32-mile drive from Lewiston, where her family lives. Kristen had dreams of writing production TV shows and educational books. She was described as witty, and she had a great sense of humor. She was absolutely brilliant. On the morning of June 26, 1981, Kristen set out on a 3-hour bike ride down to Lewiston, and she vanished along the way. Kristen David was 22 years old at the time of her disappearance. The evening before, Kristen called her mother. In those days, the landlines could call long distance, but it was always cheaper to call after 11. So when the phone rang after 11 p.m., her mother always knew it was Kristen calling. Kristen called her mother the evening of the 25th to say that she was going up to Moscow to get her bicycle and then make the 3-hour trip back to Lewiston in time for work. Kristen loved to go on long treks with her bike. So her mother said that it sounded like it was fun and that she wished she could go too. When Kristen didn't show up for work, her mother was notified. She began calling around looking for her and was unable to locate Kristen anywhere. Knowing she would not get into a car with a stranger and would not go off on her own, Kristen's mother contacts the authorities. Sadly, she is met with the same old song and dance. College kids go off on their own all the time. She'll show back up. And authorities refused to investigate until Kristen had been missing for 48 hours. Kristen's older sister, Ann Mackey, told People magazine, "I just can't imagine what Kristen went through. It was a real-life horror story happening right outside the doors of our homes. Neighbors had witnessed Kristen taking the bicycle down, so her family knew for sure she had started her trip. The family did what they felt the police should do and started investigating on their own." Her mother stated in an interview that even she knew when they began looking for her that they would not find her alive. An eyewitness did come forward stating they saw her around the Genesee Junction where they saw a man approaching her on the side of the road. He was driving a brown van. On the morning of July 4th, 1981, 8 days after she went missing, 6.5 miles downstream from the Red Wolf Crossing Bridge outside Clarkston, Washington, a fisherman makes a gruesome discovery. He spots a black garbage bag floating in the Snake River. He pulls it into his boat, rips open the bag, and to his horror, inside is human remains. He looks around and sees another bag about 75 yards away, and inside that bag is more human remains. At this point, he contacts the authorities. The authorities begin searching the area, and in total, 5 bags were found, all containing human remains. Through autopsies and tests, the remains were confirmed to be those of Kristen David. The medical examiner revealed that the body was cut with some sort of knife and speculated that the person responsible knew what they were doing. X-rays showed metallic fragments embedded into her skull, indicating a gunshot to the head. Her body was dismembered post-mortem, and there was little to no blood left in the pieces found. No internal organs were located either. Neither her clothing nor her bicycle were ever found. Authorities do believe that Kristen was dumped off the Red Wolf Crossing Bridge, likely in the middle of the night, under the cover of darkness. They discovered bloodstains on the side of the bridge to corroborate this theory. Kristen's case has been tossed around from one investigator to the next, with questions of jurisdiction rising. The case files were added on the FBI's workload due to Kristen being in Idaho at the time of her disappearance, and her body was found across state lines in Washington. Kristen David's family were able to locate her and give her a proper burial place, but they are plagued with the remaining questions of who would want to kill this vivacious young woman in such a brutal way. With no leads and no suspects and not very much evidence to go on, the case of Kristen David's brutal murder remains unsolved to this day. Nothing has ever come of the lead from the man in the brown van. No one has come forward, and authorities still do not know who the man is. As if these 2 tragedies were not enough to shake the small communities, the events of the night of September 12, 1982, surely was the final straw to send anyone into a complete panic. 3 more people vanished. Christina Nelson, Brandy Miller, and Stephen Pearsall went missing in the same night. Christina Nelson and Brandy Miller were stepsisters and best friends. They both grew up in Boise and were described as inseparable. Gloria Boberts, Christina's cousin, stated in interviews that Christina was very intelligent, gorgeous, and a super sweet person. Christina was in Lewiston attending the Lewis Clark State College studying accounting and business, even though art was her passion. Christina loved to paint, and she had painted herself a bright future, figuratively and literally. Christina took a job at the Lewiston Civic Theater to be closer to the local art scene. She worked as the custodian and eventually even had her art displayed there. Christina also participated and worked on some of the productions. Jerry Hymas, Brandy Miller's mother, Christina's stepmother, stated in interviews that Brandy herself was one hell of an artist as well, that she loved to sing and dance. Brandy was described as a very small girly girl but had a mean streak a mile long. When Jerry married Christina's father, the 2 girls quickly became close and were always together. They got along so well as true sisters, even though they were not blood related, that didn't matter to them. So naturally, when Christina went off to college, being a few years older, Brandy followed a few years later when she graduated high school. Once Brandy arrived in Lewiston, being that Kristen worked there and there happened to be an opening, Brandy also took a job at the theater. The night the girls vanished, they were spending time together at Christina's apartment just a few blocks from the theater. Expecting Christina's boyfriend, the pair left a note behind stating they were walking down to the grocery store and going to do some laundry, that they would be back shortly. Christina's boyfriend was supposed to go to her place and hang out with her after he got off work, but he ended up falling asleep and didn't go to see her. The next day, when he arrives at her apartment and finds the note left behind, thinking it was recent, he waits. When Christina doesn't come back, he thinks, well, maybe they just miscommunicated. When he still hasn't heard from her by the following day, he begins asking around. After speaking with her friends, professors, and her boss, he realizes no one has seen her. He contacts the police and files a missing persons report. Authorities quickly learn that Christina was with her stepsister Brandy, who is also missing. Officers searched Christina's apartment for clues. They were unable to find any signs of them going anywhere other than down to the Safeway grocery store and to do laundry. No signs of them packing up and taking off to start somewhere else. Christina left her cat behind and some uncashed paychecks. At the time the girls vanished, there were several cult communes in the area, places where college students were running off to live freely in the wilderness. Authorities believe that could be a possibility for Christina and Brandy, but they were not positive. About a week after Christina and Brandy are reported missing, authorities learn of another missing man, Stephen Pearsall, who was last seen the same evening entering the Civic Theater. Rhonda Albright, Stephen Pearsall's sister, described him in interviews. She stated that Stephen was very kind-hearted, always wanted to please people. She stated Stephen was very reserved, not outgoing at all. After high school, Stephen joined the Air Force. When he came home, he pursued his dreams of college at the Lewis Clark State College in Lewiston. A friend of Stephen's was the technical director at the theater and requested Stephen's help with the sets for the productions, as Stephen was also an amazing artist. Stephen would later become one of the custodians of the theater as well. Stephen had been in the theater earlier in the day of September 12th, but around 9 p.m. he joined his girlfriend for a party, and around midnight she dropped him back off at the theater to do some laundry and to practice his clarinet. A patrolman on duty at the time witnessed Stephen entering through the side door as he was driving by the location. Stephen often spent time at the theater doing his laundry and practicing. He could not practice his clarinet at home in his apartment due to several complaints from his neighbors. He walked into the theater that night and vanished into thin air, taking his duffel bag of dirty laundry and leaving his clarinet behind. At first, with all three missing, it was believed that Stephen was the suspect. During the investigation, authorities found it likely that Christina, Brandy, and Stephen all knew each other and that the girls probably walked past the theater on their way down to Safeway. That all changed on March 19, 1984. Almost 2 years after the disappearance, investigators thought they had caught a break when remains were found. 14-year-old Marvin Mead was out collecting cans along Highway 3 near Kendrick, Idaho. Marvin was walking down a ravine looking for the cans when a tree branch knocked off his hat and the hat began tumbling down into the ravine further. Once he reached his hat and secured it back onto his head, he looked down and saw what appeared to him to be a deer skull. When he picked it up, he soon realized it was human. Authorities came to investigate and found the remains of Christina Nelson and Brandy Miller. Evidence found at the scene appeared as if the suspect had dumped the bodies closer to the highway initially, then returned later to move them further down into the ravine. The bodies were tied together with a piece of rope authorities found and later tracked down to be a part of a prop from the theater. Authorities searched the massive area around where these two bodies were found, hoping maybe they would find Stephen's body. His remains were not located. Once the rope was discovered to be a part of a prop and his remains were not located, this only raised suspicion on Stephen. However, authorities were still not convinced. While searching Stephen's apartment, they found his car keys, uncashed paychecks, and his wallet, all things pointing to signs that Stephen had planned to return, not disappear. And why would he leave his beloved clarinet behind? Things were not adding up to investigators. His family has remained adamant that he would not hurt a soul or run away and not contact them. Investigators did use the substance luminol inside the theater, but this was over a year later and the heavy presence of lead paint made the test inconclusive. Autopsies revealed that Christina and Brandy were strangled. Police officials did eventually learn that there was another man present at the theater on the night in question. When they found out that the man was the last man to see little 12-year-old Christina White, this really started raising suspicions. Lance Jeffrey Voss was working on a set with Stephen for an upcoming production earlier in the evening on September 12th. During Lance's first interview with authorities, he does admit to being at the theater with Stephen, but also states after Stephen left around 9 p.m., he left as well, and he didn't see Stephen again that night. Lance told authorities that after he left the theater, he headed downtown to the Red Baron Pizza Parlor. He then stated he drank a beer, ate some pizza, and watched the weekly movie until it ended around midnight. After that, he went back to the theater to do some work on the set. During work, he hurt his back, and in trying to get some relief, he laid down around 10 p.m. and fell asleep and slept through the night until 4 a.m. He also stated he heard nothing suspicious during those hours and did not see anyone. Detectives find Lance's story implausible because they already knew Stephen had been spotted by a few people, including a police officer, entering the theater shortly after midnight to practice his clarinet. Lance would have certainly heard Stephen playing, wouldn't he? Authorities theorize that Stephen walked into the theater, walked in on the gruesome scene of the murders of Christina and Brandy, and he was at the wrong place at the wrong time and was murdered as well. Now that authorities know Voss is connected to at least 2 of the missing people, they dig deeper into Lance Voss. Investigators walked the path Christina Nelson and Brandy Miller would have taken the night they vanished and found that the Red Baron is located along the route to the Safeway. When authorities ask Lance to take a polygraph test, he declines and lawyers up. Authorities also learned that Kristen David had a connection to the theater as well. She helped work on the costumes and costume design. So it's very possible that Lance now has a connection to all 5 of the victims in this case. This revelation puts the community and investigators on edge. Learning you have a serial killer on the loose and no actual evidence to tie him to any of the crimes, the people were terrified. Authorities questioned Brian Fuller, a longtime resident of the valley. They learned from Brian that Lance used to be a scoutmaster. A lot of the parents deemed him weird for hanging around children all the time when Lance had none of his own. They also learned that Lance was somewhat of a weapons connoisseur, that he would often bring weapons he made in his own forge to these scout meetings and demonstrate how sharp they were with whole fruits. Authorities find this to be troubling as they recall the words the medical examiner in Kristen David's case said about the suspect and the body being cut with a knife. The second time authorities question Lance and ask for a polygraph, he declines, and authorities learn why. Lance confesses he has been arrested once before in San Jose, California. Investigators learn that the circumstances surrounding the arrest are very strange. He was arrested for attempting to break into a funeral home where the only body inside was that of a young woman who died mysteriously. Lance told the authorities now that it was all just a big misunderstanding back then and kind of downplayed it. Wanting to learn more, the authorities in Washington and Idaho contact the San Jose Police Department to ask them about the incident with the funeral home. Investigators learn this wasn't just a misunderstanding after all. On June 5th, 1972, a young woman by the name of Antoinette Anino was on a double date walking along the boardwalk in Santa Cruz, California. She was with her boyfriend, her brother, and her brother's girlfriend. They walked over to the pier where an argument ensued between Antoinette and her boyfriend, at which time she walked away from the group. She never came back. Early the next morning, a nude body washed ashore, and it was confirmed to be the remains of Antoinette. Authorities did search the beach for clues to what happened and could not find her clothes. Antoinette's death was ruled a suicide by drowning. Her body was transferred to a funeral home in San Jose. Later that evening, the police received a 911 call for a break-in. When the police searched Lance, he had a knife and a camera in his possession. He was dressed in all black and had removed a screen from a window. When confronted by the owner's daughter, Lance stated that he was there to see his girlfriend one last time. An odd statement, as Antoinette's body was the only one on the premises and she was not his girlfriend. Lance was ultimately arrested and charged with burglary. What authorities have learned so far is that Lance Voss has a connection to all 5 victims. Lance was the last to see little Christina White. Some even believe he was the one who gave her the cold cloth. He even offered to help law enforcement search for her. Lance worked with all 4 of the other victims at the Lewiston Civic Theater. He was even in the vicinity of the area when Christina Nelson, Brandy Miller, and Stephen Pearsall went missing. At the time of Kristen David's murder, Lance was a delivery driver who often made deliveries in the area of the Genesee Junction. 3 bodies have been recovered: Kristen David's, Christina Nelson's, and Brandy Miller's. Christina White and Stephen Pearsall are still missing. Because Stephen is still missing and might possibly be a suspect in the crime of the Civic Theater 3, as the media calls it, prosecutors cannot move forward to charge anyone in this case. Lance is only a person of interest, but the evidence against him is mountainous. In doing my research, there is a whole Facebook page dedicated to tips and leads and theories and possible other crimes Lance Voss might also be connected to. During one of the documentaries I watched, they linked 2 other possible crimes to Voss. The documentary is titled Cold Valley. It is featured on Discovery Plus. During the documentary, investigators talked about a few other cases that Lance has a connection with, one of them being an 8-year-old little girl. Diane Taylor was found on August 3rd, 1963, dumped in an alleyway in the Austin neighborhood in Chicago, Illinois. Diane had been stabbed through the heart and had multiple cuts on her body. Authorities believe that she was murdered at another location and dumped in the alleyway. Sources say that Diane attended the YMCA summer youth camp and had been there earlier that day. In another uncanny coincidence, Lance Voss lived in the area at the time, just a few blocks away from where she was found. He also went to Austin High School as he was 15 years old, and he worked at the YMCA as none other than Diane Taylor's youth counselor. Voss was one of the 750 men the authorities questioned. However, they were looking for someone who was older. They didn't possibly think that a 15-year-old would commit such a brutal crime. In 1980, a real estate agent had an interesting encounter with Voss. Voss had contacted her to sell his property in Asotin, Washington. During the walk, he insisted on showing her the basement. And when they were walking through the house, she turned around to say something to him and noticed that he had something heavy in his hand and looked as if he was ready to hit her. Voss put the item down and asked how many people knew that she was there, and she told him several people. He suddenly lost interest in showing her the basement. Authorities learned that cement work was done in that basement of that home by Voss. Law enforcement dug up the floor of the basement and they brought cadaver dogs in. Nothing was found. In 1986, Voss begins having an affair with Claudette Valivia. She works as a seamstress at the Lewiston Civic Theater and commits suicide on July 27, 1987. And Voss is the one who finds her body. Another coincidence? Or did he have a hand in her death and made it appear to be a suicide? Nothing ever came of these cases. As I stated previously, Lance Voss is just a person of interest. He has only been charged with the burglary. He has never been charged with any other connection with the 5 victims: Christina White, Kristen David, Christina Nelson, Brandy Miller, and Stephen Pearsall. Lance Voss is now 76 years old and lives in North Carolina. Is he a serial killer that got away with several murders? Police are urgent to find out. All of the family members of these victims deserve to finally have some closure and know what happened to their loved one. It has been 44 years since evil lurked in these communities, and authorities are no closer to solving these crimes. Each one still remains unsolved today. The FBI announced last year that the case of Kristen David is not a cold case. They are still actively pursuing leads. They are investigating Kristen's case separate from the other 4 cases. Gloria Boberts and Ann Mackey, along with Detective Jackie Nichols, all want to know what happened, who committed these heinous crimes. They all stated they will never stop searching for answers. They plead with the community, asking that if you have any information, no tip is too small. Please contact authorities at 1-800-CALL-FBI or the Asotin County Sheriff's Office at 509-243-4717. What do we think of these crazy, twisted cases? I admit Kristen David's murder was a lot different than the other 4 cases, but being a connection to Lance Voss, there is still that possibility. I definitely think Lance is connected to all of these cases, but there are so many unanswered questions and not enough evidence for me to say 100% that he committed all of these crimes and got away with it. There are so many coincidences, but are they just that, coincidences? Do you think authorities are on the right path with Lance Voss, Or do you think there is a serial killer among us, unidentified, that has been lurking for years, leaving his victims and their families to wonder what happened? I want to thank you all so much for joining me each week and listening to my podcast. Please like, share with your friends, and subscribe to my channel. And as always, don't forget to ramble on.